Hello and welcome back to PBH435 for our discussion on Chapter 15 on marijuana. This is Dr. Clark. So we'll start our discussion of marijuana consumption with a discussion of the plant from which it's actually derived, and this is the cannabis plant. So marijuana is a preparation of the materials from the plant. We do talk about three different species of the cannabis plant. We've got Cannabis sativa. This is the one that we know also as hemp. So it's used primarily for its fibrous products from which rope is made. And then we've got Cannabis indica. This is the one that's primarily grown for its psychoactive purposes. And then a third species, Ruderalis, that's grown primarily in Russia. When we start to talk about different cannabis preparations, we'll be talking about the concentration of THC in the product. So THC is the primary psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, and it's concentrated in the resin. So the potency of the cannabis preparation is going to depend on how much resin is present in the product that's being consumed. So the resin, or the sticky sap, is primarily concentrated in the flowering tops of the plants. We see less in the leaves of the plants and very little actually in the stalk of the plant. So depending on how much of those particular parts of the plant are included in the preparation, that will tell us how potent the cannabis preparation is. And actually, marijuana is typically categorized by how much of the plant is contained in it. So the first of those categories is hashish, or hash. So this is the most potent preparation because it involves the collection of that resin or the sap, and it's concentrated and purified. So it's much more potent than the marijuana, the smoked marijuana that most of us are familiar with. So this is actually relatively rare in the United States. Only about 1% of the confiscated marijuana in the U.S. is actually hashish. This is much more common in the Middle East and in North Africa as a method of consumption. So our next most powerful concentration would be sensimilla. So this consists mostly of the dried flowering tops of the plants. So this has a higher THC content than other parts of the plants, so it is a more potent preparation than when other parts of the plant are included. The average THC content for sensimilla is about 11%, and when we look at the more commonly smokable marijuana, then we see other parts of the plant included as well. Of course, this isn't consistent across the market. We do see about a 1% THC content in lower grade marijuana, and then it ranges up to about 11% THC for a higher grade sensimilla based product. About 50% of the marijuana that's confiscated in the United States is sensimilla, so it does have that higher potency. And in terms of why potency is a concern, we've seen this in many of the drugs that we've studied this semester. We've seen this progression from a plant that has some natural psychoactive properties that's consumed in traditional ways, and then it gets concentrated throughout the industrial era, and we see different kinds of consumption and dependence patterns as the product becomes more potent. So we do know that over time the average potency of the marijuana on the market is increasing. When we looked at confiscated samples in 1993, the average THC content was under 3.5%. By 2012, the average THC content was over 12%. So you can see that pretty rapid increase in the potency of the product. In terms of why that's happening, the drivers for that increased potency, first of all, consumer demand. People are looking for more potency in their product, and then also the illegality. So if you're going to be taking on the risk of running a criminal operation to produce and sell marijuana, you know that marijuana with higher potency will gain you more profit. So we do see that profit driver there. And then also we see more and more marijuana that's cultivated indoors, and that product also tends to have higher potency. Now, in terms of why this is concerning, we do see that link in other drugs between potency and dependence potential. In marijuana, we're seeing mixed results. We do have some studies that say that people who are exposed to more potent marijuana are more likely to become dependent, but we don't really have conclusive information on that one just yet. All right, so in terms of historical consumption of marijuana, the earliest time that we see marijuana mentioned in written materials, 2737 BC, in a book of ancient Chinese pharmaceuticals. it recommended marijuana consumption for several uses, and then by 1000 AD, we're actually seeing social use of the plant being pretty widely documented, primarily in the Muslim world and North Africa. Important to know here that marijuana consumption is not banned in the Quran like alcohol consumption is, and we also see some other cultural references. Religious cult that was founded to carry out political murders was associated with hash consumption, and we see that link there with the origin of the word assassin, and then also pretty frequent hashish use mentioned in the Arabian Nights. So a pretty widely culturally referenced product at this time. Here we've got some images of marijuana consumption in ancient Egyptian art, as well as an ancient Chinese text that talked about the medical properties of marijuana. So yet another product that we see widely consumed over human history. In terms of consumption here in the United States, as we've discussed in earlier lectures, we really didn't see a lot of regulation of marijuana until the early 20th century. So in 1926, we saw this rash of newspaper articles that linked marijuana consumption and crime. And we saw an increase in public attention to the product. At the time, marijuana consumption was associated pretty widely with Mexican immigrants, recent Mexican arrivals to the United States, and also with the jazz music scene, both of these populations being ones that were associated with discrimination. So again, we see those links in negative cultural attitudes towards the population, and then that transferring to negative cultural attitudes about the kinds of substances they tended to use. So by 1936, every state in the country had some kind of law regulating the use, sale, and/or possession of marijuana. And we really saw this cultural shift towards the perception of marijuana as a negative product. So we're going to take a quick look at a clip from a movie that was available. It's actually a trailer for a movie that was released at the time called Reefer Madness. So if you've never heard of it, we'll take a quick look and we'll see what that means.
These high school boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a quick smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
Okay, so this is an important film that parents had to see before it was too late. Their children were at risk for reefer madness. There's a lot of this propaganda and promotional material that went into and was being distributed around the country at this time. So we saw a lot of actually advertising of the negative effects of marijuana. Pretty interesting statement about the country at the time. Keep in mind this is around the same era as Prohibition, so we had a lot of activity and concern about the use of psychoactive drugs at the time. So this this period we saw a lot of misinformation being spread about the effects of marijuana, and then also this association with populations of lower privilege. So we saw these regulation effects start to coalesce based on the concerns about the effects of use, misinformation about that, and the effects, misinformation about its association with criminal behavior. Keep in mind, these were not based on evidence. They were pretty much manufactured at the time. False news stories, and then the propaganda-style movie Reefer Madness. So we also saw Anslinger, who was a prime mover in the prohibition movement, moving on now to marijuana regulation. There's actually some interesting research that's been done about Anslinger's connection to industrial producers of nylon, that he actually worked, part of the reason that he may have worked on this movement so strenuously might have been because hemp, and that other species of the cannabis plant, was a competitor to nylon. So if we could see laws passed against cannabis plants, then more opportunity for nylon to develop. So there's no real conclusion about that on a historical basis, but interesting connections that might have been associated with his motivation there. And then another important sociocultural and historical reference here is that this is the period when the United States was dealing with the Great Depression. So we saw additional prejudice develop against different kinds of populations based on the scarcity of jobs and who was able to become employed. So lots going on here at the time, but this is what we ended up with. We ended up with this environment for the regulatory environment here in the United States. So we saw the Marijuana Tax Act be passed in 1937. So it followed the same approach as the Harrison Act. So it wasn't outlawed as a product, but its production, distribution, and sale were taxed. So the result, basically, was that it was virtually impossible to deal in cannabis, even though it was typically available at, say, grocery stores or corner drugstores before this. It became virtually impossible to obtain. We also saw a change in terminology at this time, where we stopped referring to it as cannabis and we started referring to it as marijuana. Of course, that more kind of Hispanic-styled pronunciation associated more strongly with that population of Mexican immigrants. So we see again those forces of discrimination involved in making certain substances illegal while others, such as alcohol, remained legal. And then we also started seeing state laws that made the possession and use of marijuana illegal. And then finally, the Supreme Court actually declared the Marijuana Tax Act unconstitutional in 1969. So after the passage of that tax act, we also saw the price of marijuana increase significantly, which of course helped to transfer power and financial resources into organized crime. But then in 1944, we saw the first really major 20th century move that led to this cultural shift on the use of marijuana. So this is the LaGuardia report, and basically they looked at the body of medical research and they found that marijuana use had much less serious effects, medical effects, than had commonly been believed. That crazed piano playing and the link to murder and violence and suicide that we saw in the Reefer Madness trailer, not actually based in science. People weren't really ready to hear that, so there were some very strong negative reactions when that report was released. But it really was the first in-depth study. Now, we did see marijuana use increase, possibly related to the release of the report, but there was a lot going on as well throughout that period of the 60s. But we did see a peak at the time in marijuana use in the United States in the 1970s. Marijuana use decreased as cocaine use increased in the 1980s, but we're beginning to see, again, population level increases in marijuana consumption here in the U.S. Just a quick note about Anslinger, our historical figure there. After the LaGuardia report was released with its more positive interpretation of marijuana use, or at least less negative, he actually hired the American Medical Association to produce a competing report. This report actually was widely known for its racist content, and was actually so biased that the American Medical Association withdrew that in 1972.